Good morning. Please turn back with me to Song of Solomon chapter 1 as this week we continue this time looking at the Song of Solomon from the perspective of he. You may be wondering, why the same scripture reading as last week? It's kind of boring. Well, sometimes relationships are simple. And if you're going to have a common foundation, you really need to start from the same point. All right, that's a lot of words, for it's still difficult to find 2 or 3 scriptures strung together that are completely age appropriate. So you keep reading that passage and you tell me what you would pick in that chapter. That's the practical side of it. The other side is, really it did help me realize the way in which sometimes our fundamentals, they seem simple, but you leave them out enough and you start to appreciate them all over again. I remember, don't use as many sports analogies as I used to. This one's for Nick. Ben, the folks from Pullman, who used to have to listen to me use sports analogies at least once a month. But this one is about Kevin Durant. Professional basketball player. You don't get to be a pro just on talent, not at his level. He was an MVP of, I don't know if the league, but the finals, because he won a championship. Not everybody gets to win a championship. And he talked about fundamentals, saying it quite simply this way. There are times when I get into a slump. Can you believe it? Pros get into slumps. They're not playing against Joes like me. They're playing against other pros. And every now and again when equal talent meets equal talent, it's not like shoot around. And so he had some fundamentals he went back to in real time when his slump was compounded by the booing crowd and all that goes on to really live in life. And so likewise in Song of Solomon, a book that has a lot to do with relationships. There are a lot of books out there that at their best, I believe, help us understand the degree to which fundamentals, well maintained, can help you get back to, everybody got perfect relationships all the time? Okay, well, I'll sit down. No, but that's what I thought. In those situations where the relationships aren't always perfect all the time, there are some fundamentals and some core principles that we can all lean back on. And she's talking about love. And that is the way in which they both distinguish this from just being a book of awkward passages. Because he's given her a lot of compliments about her beauty, as we talked about last week from her perspective. But ultimately, when he gets down to it, what separates this pretty wife from all the other pretty wives that didn't have a book written about them? And over it goes back to the love that they commonly shared mutually between one another. And how it's one thing to be able to love one another, but it's another thing when you connect with people on a deeper level. And that seems to be what they have here, beginning in verse 1. In chapter 1. Once again, let's go back to the compliments. It's going to start off as we talked about. Let's really start in chapter 2. We talked about that whole concept in verse 2. As a lily among the brambles, so is my love amongst the young women. Oh, so what? Solomon, if we think this is Solomon, we know you're pretty smooth. At this point, you don't have 700 wives, but it seems like we saw last week, he might be up to number 60. She might be 61 at this point, right? I'm sure you said that 59 or 60 other times. What makes this one different, right? And the thing that seems to make it a little bit different goes back to what we said about what may be their shared upbringing or some things they have in common in their upbringing. Chapter 1, verse 6. Do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. Understand that the rest of this book is filled with all sorts of compliments on her beauty that can get really drowned out, not only in their repetition in the book, but the fact that you realize that, like we said, if it is Solomon, we don't know if she's 61 or 699 or 700, but he said something like this to somebody before. What makes this different? Well, if you understand where her needs are, then maybe you begin to understand why she still is willing to hear him in this situation when she knows she's not necessarily the only one. I'll put it to you like this. My mission field was not originally, where'd I go? Sorry. Malawi. That's it. My mission field was not originally Malawi. I took survey trips with one of my instructors. I'll name him because he's a friend of our brother Barry. Brother Tim. famous missionary who'd been in Brazil for years, and the only reason he went over to Africa is there was Mozambique, a Portuguese-speaking nation in Africa, was just north of where I ended up in Malawi. But we took our first survey trips to Brazil. And if you know anything about Brazil back in the day, before all the popularity of the recent surgeries and whatnot, I'm not going to name them, you can look them up on your own time, Brazil was known as a place where the women were notoriously beautiful. And I made the mistake when Tim was trying to take care of a young missionary that he figured might need a wife at some point. And he set me up to just talk with a young lady, just in a group. And I mentioned before my experience like that in Malawi, but this time it helped me understand the ways in which you need to understand culture and you need to understand an individual. Because I told her she was beautiful and she winced. See, because Malawi is not Brazil. And in a situation where the women are being told that they are beautiful because there's an agenda behind it, you have to understand that it takes a little bit more than a compliment to open a conversation. See, there are times when a woman would love to understand and know that she's beautiful, but she needs to know before that she can trust you. And so talking to people in general in Malawi was a whole lot different than talking to people, especially trying to date in Brazil. And so understand what Solomon has here. He has a situation where he, like we said, he can tell everybody they're beautiful, but he has to understand the soil. Our brother talked about on Wednesday night. He was encouraged to talk to us about the four soils, but he realized that after that, Mark realized that the parable of the wheat and the tares was for some reason calling to him. But in that parable of the soils, one of the things to realize is that when you are going out in life, talking about life, the gospel, whether or not you are in sales, whether or not you are still single, like some of us, and looking for that one, you have to understand the type of soil and the way in which the Bible goes beyond, as our brother Jake mentioned last week, beyond simply being stories about Jesus to being stories about Jesus that can help us understand wisdom for our practical lives. And so I learned a very difficult lesson about complimenting beauty, understanding that I was dealing with soil that had the thorns of a whole lot of tourism that isn't always geared towards, okay, well, can we preach Jesus? It's what you call sexual tourism, right? And so I didn't realize that Brazil was that kind of place because I was looking at it as a mission field. But understand when Solomon is approaching this young woman, he realizes even though everybody's telling her she's beautiful now, and it may seem like it's something that she needs to hear an awful lot, it may be because, as we mentioned last week, as she was growing up, before everybody began to realize how beautiful she was, ultimately what was happening is she was being cut down in ways that meant that she can receive that compliment in a way that not everybody can. And so understand in your own relationships, there are times when you are going to want to, as some of the good self-help manuals say, you're going to want to love from your perspective, meaning this is the way I want to receive love. They talk about, I think it's one book, I can't remember what it is, talks about the love bank, and it's basically like a bank account, meaning you can only do so many things that withdraw from the love bank before you got to put some deposits in the love bank. But there's also making sure that you're making the right type of deposit. It would be real silly if I got my paycheck or whatever, and after I got through taking pictures of the check to deposit in my bank account, I pulled out some cash, and I was like, I want to deposit this too. But it's not work. You can't deposit cash with your phone. Doesn't work like that yet, right? And so you have to understand what is actually a fit with the organization you're working with. Likewise, you have to understand what is a fit with the person you're actually not just married to, but the people who you are with in terms of just friendships, in terms of your relationships at work. You can be heaping the praise on people who couldn't care less about the praise because their needs are in a different area. And so what the word does is it helps you to understand what type of soil you are dealing with when you are frustrated in loving someone who doesn't seem like they are appreciating it. And understand what Solomon does here, even though he is a man that probably has a huge disadvantage that most fellas don't have. You don't have the track record that Solomon has. Oh, I know you're a ladies' man, but some of us come with a cleaner slate than that. But we may be less wise than Solomon because with his more sullied background, he does have a wisdom about people that I might not have with even a cleaner slate. And so even though Solomon might come to us looking like, oh, he's clearly disobeying God. God said don't multiply wives, right? One of the reasons why we talked about last week, dad might not be perfect, but dad might still have some wisdom that you can use. And so before Solomon just begins to heap the compliments on her, he realizes that repeated compliments aren't going to simply harden her heart. Repeated compliments may be exactly what she needs because of the way that she grew up. And understand likewise, one of the reasons why the reciprocal passage is so important is because if Solomon is giving compliments, but all he's getting is this all the time, then at a certain point he's probably going to get a little bit frustrated in terms of how it is that he's supposed to go about trying to encourage her in a way that she needs. And so one of the reasons why I said start out with the same passage, sometimes it's just important to help a person understand this is not the kind of love that I need either at this moment or just in general. It's not that I don't appreciate the effort, but if you could redirect the effort in a place that I actually need it, then you don't have to read minds and I don't have to be frustrated. And so understand the way in which Solomon, even though he may not be a man who's walking in lockstep with what God has told him, he is a man who still has the wisdom that God gave him. Because God describes himself as being what? Faithful. It's not every time I make a mistake, God's taking it all away. All the gifts, they're just gone. Because that's how we sometimes turn our ears on and off, right? There are times when just because I'm frustrated, I don't want to hear it. And that's me. And like we talked about recently, sometimes you have to be ready for the times when God can speak to you through the youngins and through the Solomons, understanding that just as Solomon can still give wisdom, God willing, Solomon can still take wisdom. And I can be like, hey, Solomon, I appreciate what you're saying, but I did take your advice, but now can you take a little from me? I'm not sure we still need to keep marrying women. I think we would be good at if this is 60, we could probably stop at 60. I can't tell you anything because you're the king, but I do know that I don't have to be the king to be able to remember what God told you. And it was don't multiply wives. Why? Because if she's truly going to appreciate you, why continue to put her in that situation over and over again where her love has to be tested unnecessarily? It's enough to say we made it through this hurdle. But to continue to go back to the same situation that tests love over and over again, it's tempting. It's like you're playing with fire. You can play with it in one circumstance, and it's whatever. You can play with it next to another material. That material's pretty durable. It's not flammable. But you strike matches long enough, and something's going to catch fire. Likewise, you repeat the same trying behavior over and over again. There's another thing I used to say at Pullman. Eventually you get forgiven, but you don't get back the same person you had before the blow up. Eventually, the reason why deposits in the love bank are so important is because there's a certain point at which you overdraft to the point where just check with the credit bureaus. There's only so much stuff you can do before your credit score begins to And so eventually what happens is you just don't have enough left. Of course you've been forgiven. That's the command. But God doesn't tell people to trust you the same way the 700th time. And that's why the Bible says in Hebrews over and over again, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. Because you don't know what you'll get back this time. Even though you're right, they biblically do have to forgive you. You don't know what form of them you will get back. And so appreciate the love that you are getting from those who are willing to forgive you. Going forward though. In chapter 3, one of the reasons why such in some ways for me, just such a beautiful song is the way it goes back into, like we talked about when I first got here, the whole concept of foundation. This goes back into some deeper principles. It helps to understand the history of what's going on in Israel and what's going on with Solomon to understand what he is actually offering her when in chapter 3, verse 6, it seems to be describing a wedding and quite possibly Solomon's wedding to the beloved when it says, what is that coming up from the wilderness like columns of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense and with all the fragrant powders of a merchant? Behold, it is the litter of Solomon, Around it are 60 men, some of the mighty men of Israel, all of them wearing swords and expert in war, each with his sword at his thigh against terror by night. Look, think of what he's offering her. Think about what his dad had in the way of mighty men. Think about the numbers of men one of those mighty men was able to kill by themselves, and that is the way they distinguished them. It wasn't because I like you or I like you. It was because of what these guys were able to do. And we talked about inheritance. Well, Solomon might not have been able to give a great inheritance to Rehoboam, but he still had the mighty men. And that's something that's a lot to be maybe proud of, or say, at least we got that. And so understand how that goes back to David. And David didn't leave him empty-handed because he didn't have to assemble the mighty men. They assembled around David because David was more a man of war. And so that's just an inheritance he could pass on to Solomon. And Solomon at least took care of that because even though he was only going to hand over 2 tribes, he left 2 tribes that were pretty secure. But understand the way it didn't mean the same thing for King Saul. Why? Because King Saul assembled mighty men around him as well. You'll see it in the study guide, God willing. Because ultimately he assembled every mighty man he could find when David was living out in that cave. And David was starting his mighty men from the leftovers. But what happened with Saul was he led in a way that it doesn't necessarily say he got all of those mighty men killed. But he got a good portion of those mighty men killed. And here, I got to talking with Nick, apologizing for all the ways I beat him up in video games and whatnot. But no, that doesn't really, y'all don't get that one. Anyway, I'm lying. Nick usually works a preacher over in video games. And video games are where you get to respawn your mighty men. If they die, they don't really die. They just kind of come back. And we read these stories, sometimes it seems like, oh, they're just going to respawn. But if you go through the history of Israel at this time, every time they went through a battle where they lost mighty men after the days of David and Solomon, it was a perpetual decline into the captivity, where they were more and more vulnerable each time they went into a foolish battle, unnecessarily losing the gifts that God gave them. They don't get to respawn. And that's the thing we often don't think about going into battle. And so it's awesome that he can provide her with tremendous security. But he remembers that just as we are going forward to the book of Isaiah, by the time you get to Isaiah chapter 5, God's going to remind them that that's not just a history lesson. There are some problems we can't shoot. There are some problems in life we can't bomb. And there are some problems in life Israel was not going to be able to work through with sword, and they didn't use chariots as much, but all the weapons of warfare they had at their disposal. Because by the time, as we're approaching Isaiah chapter 5, he's saying we're going to run that back. From the sense that understand that the mighty men of Israel are about to fall again. Why? Because it's the relationship with God that makes the mighty men have any value at all. And so understand, in relationships, when you are establishing your home, it's one thing, yes, do all you can to get it as secured as you can. Like we have here at the church, we have the brothers who are working on making sure that we are as secure as we can. But the one thing I hope and I think all of these brothers appreciate is their skills and talents need the backing and the leading, God willing, of God. Because God can arrange circumstances where everything falls in the line with your plan. Or God can arrange circumstances where all of the flaws in our best laid plans are exposed the wrong way. I don't think I'm insulting anyone to say that, because that's just the reality of life. And so to the security that Solomon is offering her, I don't think there's any better security available, not just in Israel, but understanding where Israel was in the world at this time. Just look at it right now. How is that tiny nation holding up against all the enemies that they have over and over again? Not to get into politics, but there are some prophecies that suggest to you they aren't going away until God says, okay. The prophecies Brother Barry is taking us through suggest that there is something more than just Israel's army that is supporting their ability to survive all these attacks year after year, decade after decade. And one of the reasons is prophesied from this period of time on. God said, if you will simply do the things that I'm asking you to do, the simplest security systems of the smallest nation will hold up better than whatever you think you can cook up as the great empire of Greece, as the great empire of Persia, as the great empire of Rome, as the great empire of all those monsters or symbols that Barry has taken us through in the Revelation. As they have come and fallen, they have not they have not risen to what they once were. However, we still have Israel. One more time tiny nation, no bigger than Texas, still standing, as they say, 10 toes down. I'm going to say it's not because Israel is special. It is because Israel is holding to the promise that God has made them. Understand what that means in your life. No matter what your family situation looks like, you may be able to afford the best security system. You may not be able to afford much at all. One of the things I was happiest about is in a situation when I did go over to the mission field in Malawi. And folks are sometimes encouraging missionaries, you got to build a house with high walls, and you got to have a security guard, and you got to have this because you got money in a situation where people don't have it. It was watching the missionaries who learned how to live without a security guard, without a wall, without a gate, because they did genuinely trust God to protect them. See, instead of doing all of that, they simply loved the people around them to the point where, and I've talked about it before, there are times when you go into the police officers in Malawi and you don't get a court hearing because they're going to decide it right there. And in a town that size, they already know who you are. They already know what you've done. And they already know the person that you are at odds with. And who you have been to the people around you has an awful lot to do with whether or not you're safe. Not just on those times when you've accidentally left your door open, or those times when you risk, well, should I really have built a taller wall? But those times when you have to go into law enforcement, and law enforcement appreciates the fact that, like I said, I'm going into Malawi. I'm trying to find out who can I follow? Who can disciple me because I'm new here? Following those who have decided that they can build a life simply trusting that God can protect me in a situation where I have plenty to steal and not a whole lot to offer in the way of resistance. Does that mean you're always going to be safe? Of course not. I can get robbed tomorrow. If any of y'all know, I'm pretty protective around mine. And so that doesn't mean that you have an insurance policy. But what it does mean is you are not going to be attacked any moment sooner than God has said it's going to happen. And understand this. If I have started my life with the principle that, wait a minute, at that point, like our brother was mentioning, that I got baptized, I said that I was basically giving up everything for God. Then I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm going to die. I don't have to try to manipulate the circumstances of how I'm going to die. God willing, the more mature I get, as our brother mentioned about maturity, I mature to a place where I simply understand, God, I don't get it now, but how is it that my death ended up, God willing, moving not only your message forward, but actually providing some kind of benefit to those who are left behind. I say that because I'm tempted to say too much one time, but the reason why that stands out to me is because we have a young airman who just got shot in Florida. He made the mistake of answering his door with his pistol at his side. The officer who drew down on him shot him because he saw the pistol and he didn't necessarily pay attention to what the young man was doing with that. And so to some of us, that just seems like, oh, it's just a terrible mistake. To others of us, that seems like a situation where, oh, wait a minute, that's one of the worst injustices I've seen. But to others of us, once we got to find out who actually got shot, and they began to describe where the condolences were coming from, this was a hero amongst heroes. And as the condolences began to pour in from all over the world, they began to realize that this wasn't just some other average individual who got shot. You just murdered a man. You just shot a man who was defending our country. And his efforts, not just the fact that he put on a uniform, the things that he had done distinguished him all over the globe. And so I don't understand why that young man had to fall, but I do understand that his death got attention in the way that many other deaths have not. And so likewise, when we were hearing a communion talk about the way in which Christ died, everybody thought it was over when Christ died, right? The cool thing about what Brother Barry mentioned in terms of the road to Emmaus is they were distressed as Jesus was literally there breaking down the scriptures to them, completely confused as to what had just happened because he died, and they thought, wait, the kingdom's supposed to last forever. But what he was doing was simply helping them understand how his death fit into something larger than his life, at least his life here on earth. And so that's where the security systems have to basically fall from me. See, because the older I get, the more I realize that I might not understand my death. I might die an unjust death. I might not get it. But at a certain point, I simply pray to God that I've lived the kind of life that makes my death matter. And so whether it's just or unjust, my hope isn't in the gun, my hope isn't in the security system. My hope is that if God holds me up, it is glory to God that somebody who was that dumb stayed that safe for that long. Or, amen, right? Or that when he did die, we didn't get it at the time, but this is what God was doing. And so understand Solomon's litter, it was a protection that was endorsed by the meaning that God gave to it. These were the mightiest men in Israel. But understand, they're headed to a future by the time we get to Isaiah, the very next book we're headed into, where the mighty men aren't going to matter anymore. As we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that God willing, whether we live or die, our lives matter because God is using us in life and in death for something important that he's hoping to do. Going forward, one of the things that is going to help to bond their relationship is in chapter 5. Beyond all of the encouragement, beyond all of the protection, chapters 4 and 5 are going to help us understand the way in which his candor is quite possibly going to help these compliments have meaning. In verse 9, where he will say, or actually going on, let's start with one of the compliments. In verse 7, you are altogether beautiful, my love. There is no flaw in you. Come with me from Lebanon, my bride. Come with me from Lebanon. Depart from the peak of Amana, from the peak of Senir and Hermon, from the dens of lions, from the mountains of leopards. You have captivated my heart, my sister, my bride. You have captivated my heart with one glance of your eyes, with one jewel of your necklace. How beautiful is your love, my sister, my bride. And we'll stop there. Oh, sister part sounds weird, but at the same time, if you understand God willing, the degree to which the concept of she is going to reply mutually with my brother, my friend. It's the depth of the relationship. And it's one thing if one person thinks that they are in the midst of somebody who they love dearly. You've probably all been there before. If you ever had your heart broken, you know what it's like to love somebody who doesn't love you back, or loves you back a little bit different, or in a way that just ain't going to make it work. And so what they have here is a situation where the beauty is basically turned into the fact that I'm not just seeing you as beautiful. You have now captivated me, because he's ending up by talking about the way that she loves him. And so understand, just as we talked about that whole concept of, look, if he is going to be able to dial the compliments into a place that matters, they're going to have to communicate. And when he messes up, he's going to have basically thick enough skin as the king, not to be like, I'm the king, I know what I'm doing. I got 700 women. What do you think I don't already? No. He's going to have to still be willing to learn that she isn't like however many people he's met before. It's going to have to still be teachable. And it's that thing we saw in Ecclesiastes, which makes it seem like this is Solomon all over again. Because in Ecclesiastes, he started out in the low point. He was super depressed. But he was able to continue, as he was writing, to almost write himself out of the depression, as he not only focused on what was wrong with his condition, but he was able to let his own writing not fixate on what was wrong, but allow God to show him some other things that he was able to actually still enjoy in life, a step at a time. And so that same tendency to remain teachable, even though he was the wisest man in the country at this time, is possibly going to help improve his relationship as well. Because no matter what we are able to do outside of the home, there are some places where we are all going to spend the rest of our lives being teachable, God willing, if we will let him. And if we will let him teach us through the people that he has put around us. And so understand that beyond this whole concept of being captivated, because we can all get hustled. You think just because Solomon's the smartest, he can't get hustled too? Well, he got hustled. Why was there a problem with all these wives? Just because he married too many women? No, they were literally turning his heart away from serving God. And so it wasn't so much that he was on an unequal playing field. He's just so smart and they're just all so simple because there's 1,000 of him and one of him and ha-ha. No. They actually began to turn the nation in another direction. Like we sometimes say, they didn't need an advanced degree. They didn't need to have a title. They didn't need to have a special anointing from God. There are two kinds of wisdom in this world. There's godly wisdom and there's worldly wisdom. And God tells us to stay away from places that minimize the effect of his wisdom. And that was one of the reasons why he said, stay out of these certain situations. Why? Because Superman had kryptonite, right? It wasn't tough in every situation. As men, we have some built-in weaknesses that if we are not careful, Brother Barry has been talking about for weeks, will allow him to build up a Goliath just long enough to make him ready for a foot sweep. To make him ready for the one thing that it might not be in the same place, but we all have a vulnerability. We all have, you've seen a person who has keys, a lot of keys to a building. God always has the master key to our locks. So no matter how invulnerable we might seem, he has the hack, and all he has to do is whisper it to the simplest of people to unlock us and drop all of the defenses. Understand, he literally says that he uses the meek to humble the mighty. How did it happen to Samson? Was Delilah a prophetess? Or did she just understand men's weaknesses really well? Like we said at the very beginning, was it a calculus of schemes? Or did she just hit a bunch of singles over and over until his defenses were borne down? Delilah didn't have to hit a home run. She was just persistent. And as strong as Samson was, and as wise as Solomon was, it was the fundamentals that ended up getting them both. And so understand how the fundamentals are giving Solomon another opportunity to make good on mistakes that he's made, even if he's going to continue to make them over and over. It's the fact that he understands that there's something beyond her looks that has to basically account for why is this one different? Why is this one different? And he may not completely understand until we keep reading. Please keep reading. Turn with me to chapter 7, because he's going to say a couple other things in chapter 7 and 8 that may give us another clue as to why this one might be different. Verse 5, your head crowns you like caramel, and your flowing locks are like purple. A king is held captive in the tresses. How beautiful and pleasant you are, O loved one, with all your delights. I'm going to Kobe Bryant's story now. Back when Kobe Bryant passed, there was this huge debate about, do you just talk about the good stuff or do you talk about all of it? And one part of all of it was the fact that he had an affair for which he was actually charged with as an assault, right? And then when you look at his wife, I'm telling you from just my carnal perspective, I was like, wait a minute, I don't know if people get much prettier than that. And so that's when I had to start waking up and realizing that there are times when it's not when you, I love a comedian who broke it down this way. He said, you don't understand the level of temptation they're functioning at. He said, because I'm a moderately famous comedian and it's ridiculous. But when you get to superstar status, you don't understand what it's like. So your criticism might want to be couched in the fact that you're trying to judge him from your level of temptation, when his might be a little different. That's not to dismiss our level of temptation, because we all share a common flaw. Meaning, just like the love novels and everything, not the love novels, but the help manuals for your marriage, tell you have to understand how to love your spouse the way that they want to be loved, the way that they need to be loved. You have to understand one of the reasons why that's so important is because there are people out there with ill motives who are just as wise as a Delilah who can see what your man is missing as soon as they look at him. I'm the bringer of bad news. That's just it. That's how life works. And likewise, it goes the other way. There are people who in life who, because of the fact that they've made it their business to be wise in all of the ways that God has told us to stay away from, it doesn't take them very long in a conversation to see what your woman is missing. And so understand, when Solomon is helping us to understand that beyond beauty, they may be connecting at a level that says, okay, just like I need to maintain all the things going on here and all the things that are going on there, because if I neglect what's going on with my car, like I had in this week, then the bills get out of control. The home is the same way. It's not always the pretty faces. It's not always the handsome figures in the bank accounts that are able to swoon or tear down a marriage. It's one of the things I learned in a polygamous society, where it was nothing for a man to have not only his wife, but you had to be very careful, because you had to know not only who he was married to, but you had to know who he was dating that day, because it's a different culture. And I might not be able to afford 5 wives, but I can't afford 2 wives and a few side pieces. And so you have to understand the way in which ultimately there are people who study, as we said, life from the perspective of, I told some of the people in the young adults class, one of the things I loved about one of my stops at work was it was a place where people not only gave me the peace to be a Christian, even though a lot of them were Muslims, they actually were matchmaking kind of. I was like, what are y'all doing? But when you're in a situation where it's kind of tough out there, it's difficult to find people, as we talked about, it's difficult for the college students to walk around campus and just find people who are willing to say hi. There's so many layers you have to get through just to find friends at maybe high school or just walk around town. One of the things about Lewiston I like a lot, people are generally pretty nice. That didn't carry everywhere you go. And there are some places where it's tough just to meet people. And so when you get to an environment where people are actually like it used to be, they realize life's kind of tough alone. And they're looking out for you and trying to help you, you appreciate that a little bit more than you may appreciate all the other places you've been. See, because this is no longer just a work environment. I'm around people who actually seem like they care. And so understand the way in which Solomon appreciates that I can take care and do maintenance on everything. But just like that company realized, maybe if you're in a happy situation at home, we can keep you happy and productive here in this environment. And so if the better companies understand that, please appreciate the wisdom that Solomon has here. Appreciate the way in which it can be difficult to keep our relationships and just our friendships fresh. But the amount of maintenance we do on the front end of making sure that they don't just have to tell us, okay, this is the way I generally receive love. Maybe pick up one of those books this week. I can't remember the one, but it's the one, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, maybe you don't. It's one of those books that talks about, like we said, his needs, her needs, that's it. So maybe, shameless plug, I got no financial interest in it, but his needs, her needs is one of those books that comes from a Christian perspective and talks about the ways in which you can overcome the frustration of trying to love a person in ways they're completely disinterested in loving. And you can make it easier to love a person if you simply do a little bit of the difficult work on the front end, going back to the Kevin Durant example. Sometimes when you hit a slump in life, I just want to move forward. But I remember the first movie, Men in Black, where they reached an impasse. They didn't know how they were going to save the world this time. And so it just seemed like it was out of reach. And I think it was Tommy Lee Jones simply said, pie. It's like, what does mathematics have to do with the problem we have? He's like, no, pie. We need to go get dessert. And I've described it before as a youth minister. Somebody described for me, Marcus, there are times in life when you need to pull all-nighters, but there are times in life when you just need to bring muffins. And there are times when just having pie or taking a break from the stress will unlock your mind and make you ready to receive what God is ready to show you. How does that work out in your relationship, Solomon? There are times in life when I simply need to take a step back and try to quit figuring out how I'm going to fix this problem that I'm now in with these 700 and this 300. And I just need to go back to the fundamentals of what made me Solomon in the first place. If in the midst of this 1,000, God has blessed me with one that I still connect with on an unusual level, maybe I just go back and learn what it was to keep her happy back before I got distracted. Back before I thought 70 or 80 or however many else were going to make me happy. Maybe I take some time away and focus on the fundamentals. Why is that? Because as you get to the New Testament, Peter's going to say something super strange, or that seems super strange, but super rational to me about a question that Jesus asked that is actually super strange. See, Jesus is going to be in a crowd of people on his way to do a healing that he's by now been known for doing. And as he's on his way, it's a famous story, you've heard it, somebody just reaches out and touches the hem of his garment. At a certain point, the response is, who touched me? I can't say that's how he said it. But the bottom line is he said, who touched me? And the apostles, one version in Mark is going to say the apostles, and Luke is going to say the apostle Peter is going to be like, what do you mean who touched you? Everybody's pressing you. How are we supposed to know who's touching you? And he probably didn't say it like that to God, but, right? But there was something about the character of that woman that made the touch of just the hem of his garment a whole lot different than everybody who was touching him at that same time in that crowd. And now understand, as we go back to the Song of Solomon, there was something in the relationship that he had with this young woman that might have made her different amongst the 700 and the 1,000. And just because he strayed doesn't mean he couldn't go back to the very beginning of whatever they have here in Song of Solomon and say this wasn't just a love song, but this was the foundation of where we started. And so understand in life when it seems like it is in a wreck, it's piled up, as Paul, you think your faith may be shipwrecked. Understand that this is a book, as our brother Josh said, it goes way beyond the love story. This is a metaphor for your relationship with God. And understand the ways in which, here's the question, we all come to church regularly. But if Christ were in the midst of us right now, we were pressed on him, not necessarily physically touching him, but he was in our presence, and he can really feel us. He knows us in ways nobody else does. Would he feel that we were going beyond simply touching him by sitting here in the assembly to a place where we were actually reaching him at a place where he has called us to live our lives? And for me, that's when the Song of Solomon began to take on a completely different significance. See, it can not only help you fix your relationship with your spouse, your friends, your coworkers, but it can help you, as our brother said on Wednesday, help me do a reevaluation of whether or not I am actually living the kind of life that is touching the Christ, or really reaching him, as opposed to simply being in his presence and pressing him with some need or some request or something that I'd like him to do for me. Understand how this is so similar to what you will see in Psalm 45. And turn with me there, please, as we close. We're going to see another marriage ceremony. Psalm 45, I sometimes wear out, and I might have preached a little bit here. It's a song of the sons of Korah. It describes another marriage ceremony that sounds like an awful lot like it might be talking about the Christ, where it reads in verse 1, "My heart overflows with a pleasing theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is like the pen of a ready scribe. You are the most handsome of the sons of men. Grace is poured out on your lips. Therefore, God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and majesty." As he goes on in verse 8 to say, your robes are all fragrant with myrrh and aloes. Your robes are all fragrant with myrrh and aloes myrrh and aloes and cassia. From ivory places, stringed instruments make you glad. Daughters of kings are among your ladies of honor. At your right hand stands the queen in gold of Ophir. Hear, O daughter, and consider and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house, and the king will desire your beauty. Since he is your Lord, bow to him. The people of Tyre will seek your favor with gifts and the richest of the people. All glorious is the princess in her chamber with robes interwoven with gold. In many colored robes she is led to the king, with her virgin companions following behind her. With joy and gladness they are led along as they enter the palace of the king. It's another marriage ceremony. And the thing that always catches my attention when I read through this, when I'm preparing or just meditating for life, is the way in which he says in verse 10, "Hear, O daughter, and consider and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house, and the king will desire your beauty." Understand that this is another marriage ceremony where her beauty is stunning, but the question is, going forward, how are they going to maintain this household? And understand, if Solomon is marrying a beautiful woman, he's offering her Solomon's litter as protection, and he's also offering her all the best that the kingdom has to offer. And he's saying she's starting out on a footing where, even though he can't present himself as the purest of men, he is letting her know genuinely, in a way that she believes, she is the one among all the rest. The question going forward is going to be, what is she going to do with that? And it has everything to do with what she's willing to let go of and leave behind to embrace what she actually has. And we touched on the point last week. She is not necessarily going to be able to maintain the favor of a king over a lifetime if she is trying to make the king's house, the palace, a fit with what she had back in daddy's house. She is going to run the risk of burning through all of the favor she has with the king if every time he comes around, she is trying to wonder whether or not you love me as much as you love the 60. She is going to run the risk of losing all of the favor that she has in the king's household if she doesn't learn to trust him in the situation that she's married into. And so understand how that plays out in our lives as Christians. Christ gives us the opportunity to come to him with a blessed status. But forever is an awful long time to live with people who are constantly trying to massage what you were trying to do as Christ into something that fits with what they're used to. And so understand, when we're trying to answer that question, when we wonder, when I come to Christ, am I moving past merely being a presence around him to am I really touching him? Is understand the simple reality that Solomon had in this young woman that seems to have her stand out. She wasn't simply beautiful, but she was pleasant, and the way in which she loved him for some reason distinguished her, in addition to the way that she seems to have struggled in a way that not everybody could have related to him, or that made her relate to him in a way that not everybody could. And so understand that when we have each of us an experience that Christ can relate to, things that we say from time to time, places that we hurt that nobody else, we don't even want to talk about to anybody else. See, once we get over that fact that the Holy Spirit is a constant presence with us, thinking that the Holy Spirit's just there to catch me in doing something wrong, one of the benefits in confession is, once again, realizing that the Holy Spirit is trying to get me into a place where I no longer have to be ashamed of my struggles, but I really have a friend, even if I don't have another friend on this earth I can trust, that I can open up to with candor, begging him to help me be transformed from what I came into this congregation as into something that's genuinely a fit with what he has prepared for me. And so when we're looking at the Song of Solomon, ultimately we're looking at a circumstance where more and more, the reason why I struggle quite often is I struggle with the illustrations I should shut up about and the illustrations I should use. But the reason why that matters is we're living in a circumstance now where as churches we're often wondering why we are having a hard time recapturing the interest of our young people. Why are we having a hard time with the rates of attrition with students once they go to college? We're blessed with a large number of students who are not simply here in school, but they've stuck with us. The problem that I am seeing in terms of what he will say, Christ, to the church at Ephesus, is as the churches of Christ, we are notorious for our doctrine, wanting to be doctrinally sound. But what we aren't always as known for is maintaining our first love. And there are 20 different stations the kids can turn to if they want to hear us win the culture wars. But there is only one place they can really come to if they want to hear something different than what they're most oftentimes running away from when they click on their phones or they turn on their TV. And so when I am talking or hearing men who are delivering lessons, I'm going to take a second. I really appreciated what I heard this morning. Because what I heard this morning in the communion talk was a lesson that was deeply rooted not only in the scriptures, but in study. You don't get that everywhere. And to the degree we have that, that's unique. See, it's one thing if the preacher gets up and just starts running off at the mouth about, let's have a deeper understanding of, no. But the congregations across this nation that have impressed me more than any, there's one, I can tell you there's one. Why? Because they're rare. I went to that church during COVID over the break. Only reason I went there is because I was staying away from the house trying to protect my grandmother. Because I didn't get the shot, and so I was staying away. But that drove me to another congregation in another part of Houston. And I showed up one Sunday. And I was like, man, that guy's a pretty good preacher. But then I showed up another week, because I was there for about a month. There's another guy doing Sunday night. I thought, man, that guy's a pretty good preacher too. And I showed up, I took a little break, and I went another week, and there was a different guy. He was preaching. And it got to 4 guys, and I was like, man, well, I thought you were the preacher, brother, from week 1. But now which one is the preacher? Oh, the preacher's not here. He's on vacation just like you. The preacher was gone. And there are 4 men who stepped up and were able to bring it. I didn't hear the culture wars once that month. But I saw something that was rare. I saw men who were deeply steeped in the Word of God. And they were all able to bring it. And so when we talk about are we going to be able to get back to our first love, as Christ challenged the church in Ephesus, what kinds of things are we doing that distinguish us from every other group of people that's out there fighting a culture war? What kinds of things are we doing that offer our young people something to come back to? Which is why sometimes we say when we offer the invitation, it's not just for people who haven't been baptized, but it's for those of us who genuinely want to find a way to be distinct in a way that says this is anointed by God. Even if we don't believe in those phrases, when you step into a church, you hear a man speaking, you're like, that's the preacher. Nope. That's just my dad. Right? And so that's the kind of restoration, God willing, we seek as believers when we come back every week, whether or not we need to get baptized or not, when we hear the invitation. So we say, it's my prayer for my prayer for you is my prayer for me. That as we go forward, God willing, we seek a relationship with God that no longer finds him feeling pressed by our presence, but takes us into a place where we're going beyond just touching him, to genuinely reaching God to help him notice the way that we are actually living the lives he has called us to live as we together stand and